Okay, so moving on to our next author, actually going to cover Venture Smith. And interesting enough, we have a little bit more information on Venture Smith, and I have some other materials here. Let me give you a background first, and then I'll show you sort of what's on our page. But we're going to be looking at a narrative of the life and adventures of Venture Smith, a native of Africa, but resident above 60 years in the United States of America, which is a title unto itself. But when you're looking at some of the other famous autobiographies of some authors we're going to read, yes, there's not a ton on Venture Smith. Of course, he doesn't have as much as maybe Oluda Equiano, Frederick Douglass, and some of these other authors that we're going to be looking at. But certainly, Venture Smith, for anything that he's kind of gone through here, none of his work was ever reprinted during his lifetime. So that's one thing compared to some of the other authors. And a lot of his stories, going through, his narrative is really, really important to look at. And we're going to be reading Oluda Equiano for next week. And you might have heard of him before because he's included in a lot of anthologies and a lot of materials. But for very much Venture Smith and how he goes through his narrative here, don't let the paragraphs and pages sort of fool you. It's really, really interesting, and the importance of what he's writing needs to be kind of taken care of. He's very much, as your Norton calls him, an extraordinary man. He's like a Franklin, a Washington, except he's enslaved African American. He's very much more representative of Black people subjected to the North American slavery than other writers and other activists were, such as Equiano, because, his experience was much longer. He talks very much about the harshness of slavery in New England during this time, especially going through and trying to figure out what America is. He goes back and he'll trace his origins to West Africa, to where he was born the son of a prince of the tribe of Dukaranda, and he thinks around 1729, hence the question mark, because again, that's very much unknown. His portrayal of how he grows up in Africa has very much little in common with the image of life that, talks about, and if you're going to read some other autobiographies, talks about family separations, invaders, his father's death. So it's not an easy life nor narrative to kind of come about apart. And then, of course, talking about the Middle Passage, and the way he talks about the Middle Passage too. So he's renamed Venture by his first master. His journey, very much takes him over to Narragansett, Rhode Island, and that's where he lives and works as a slave. He's married, and at 22 tries to escape, but it doesn't work. His punishment ends up being sale, and that separates him from his wife and daughter, to a man who he definitely did not get along with. Till finally, he refused to work until he was purchased by another white man, and this person ended up promising his chance to buy him freedom. But of course, that wasn't anything what it nearly turned out to be, because he was sold again after that. And at that point, he was sold, but it allowed Smith to hire his time as a woodcutter, a farmer, and a fisherman, so he could get his own money for his own purchase. And at finally 36, he was allowed to buy himself, which seems so backwards and crazy, and we'll talk about that. So here he's very much talking about his release from slavery, almost very anticlimactically. In the last chapter of his autobiography talks about his post-emancipation pursuit of what is his American dream. He did get some material wealth to try to get security, respect, just treatment, but certainly, at much later and a cost in his lifetime. I'll direct you here because I think it's quite interesting to see, first and foremost, in the past couple years, this was a very interesting article that kind of came about, to what archaeologists believe they've actually unearthed the tomb of Venture Smith. And so I'll even link to this right over here, of what they've called him, in essence, the Black Paul Bunyan. So, very interestingly enough, that archaeologists, and this was back about in 2006, and what they found was they hoped by digging up 200-year-old graves of a slave family that they thought they could find Venture Smith, of course, what they're calling the Black Paul Bunyan. Obviously, people gave their blessing for this. You're not just going to go and do this without that. But because of his stance, he was 6'1", and he weighed more than 300 pounds, according to, again, we have to go on sort of folklore and oral tradition passing us down. He's said to have carried a 9-pound axe and split 7 cords of wood each day. And his biography describes him carrying a barrel of massils on his shoulders for miles and hauling hundreds of piles of salt. So the slave narrative, of course, that we're looking at this week is one of the most important works. What they say, and interestingly enough, let's go over here, scientists say a look at his remains could help indicate his height and weight, his diet, injuries he suffered. DNA taken from him, his wife, his son, his granddaughter could also very much help pinpoint where in Africa he was born and help absolutely verify any account of his early life there. And this really helps us, again, from one of his descendants here, believe us that they're not just fables, they're real true stories here, that these, of course these things happen. He was a real person. Of all, which I think is really, quite sad, of all the early Black writers, his was the only grave that they could identify. So quite extraordinary that they were very much going into that too. They think, from family members and historians, he was born around what would be modern day Ghana. And again, from what you're reading and from our background, we know that he had worked side jobs until eventually he brought his freedom, and then saved up for the freedom of his wife and his sons. So he was buried beneath a marked headstone in a small, well-kept cemetery in a Riverside, Connecticut town. And so the archaeologists were working to unearth his remains. Now, of course, at that point, some people did, challenge that it was disrespectful to his legacy, but they did go on, as his descendants wished to. So you can definitely read more about this. I thought that was quite interesting. The other pieces on Venture Smith that we have here are the Venture Smith Project and a really interesting, very short NPR piece. So the Venture Smith Project is all dedicated to going through his works, the exhibit's narrative, a timeline of his life, any publications that have been done. So especially if you end up wanting to research Venture Smith a little bit more, this will be of great use to you. Any events and documents, book prizes and programs that are now sponsored in terms of his study, which is really cool. And just some more information on his actual narrative in itself, which you can even listen to some of the chapters in full. We're only reading a small excerpt, obviously, but you can read the entire narrative here. And it's really beautifully looked at, I think, in an online digital space. So you should totally check that out. The other thing I would tell you to look at is the NPR piece that was done a couple of years ago, again, talking about him as sort of the quote-unquote Black Paul Bunyan. And if you go back to the USA Today kind of tab with this as well, this will be a short piece that, if it loads, hopefully. Hopefully you can just read. I think it was just a couple minutes to listen and read to. Again, promoting and talking about Venture Smith as this very, interesting sort of figure in itself that sometimes you wouldn't know about. So again, just a couple minutes, you can listen, and to read the transcript here, they actually very much were talking about how they wanted to keep his legacy alive. And they get to interview one of his descendants, an 8th generation directly descendant from Venture Smith. So I found that was really interesting to read and to listen to, and to talk about, to really apply the history with the family experience here, and just see the legacy kind of passed down. So I would totally very much encourage you to read and to listen to this. Again, just a couple minutes. I think you'll find that you'll have a really cool understanding of Venture Smith that I don't even know if any of you have heard about him before, or maybe if you have, it was just incredibly briefly. So he is certainly, we're going to go through his narrative for this week, and I do think you'll find it as a good starting point to very much start off these accounts in a lot of different respects of how African Americans are detailing their own lives, of what they're going through, and how that, of course, plays into our kind of knowledge and portrayal. So again, you can find all of these on here. We'll have one more piece that we're looking at, Lucy Terry, for this week, but also I want to encourage you to look at some of the other background pieces that I've put on here from the National Humanities Center, The Making of an African American Identity, which really ties up and plays a big role with what we're looking at in terms of talking about the time frame that we're looking and dealing with. This again will be incredibly helpful for some of the research that we get into. There's great questions to think about in terms of framing, talking about freedom and enslavement and community. You can look at text by date in terms of a PDF, which is also helpful, I think, in terms of your own writing. And here, just kind of going back to some of these earliest times that we are going to be reading a great deal of these authors too. But I also think it's very helpful just to kind of look at this in full kind of retrospect. And in addition, for week 2 up here, I also included some slave narratives in the Federal Writers Project and free people telling their stories, which is nice to kind of just put into context compared to some of the other pieces that we're looking at for this week. So I always think it's really important to actually hear and take in, and certainly we'll listen to these as we go along in the semester too, to kind of compare as we go back with some of the earlier ways that different African Americans are using their voices, the only way that they can, by writing, especially going back into the latter part of the 1700s. So this will be really good for us to look at, and I look forward to us talking about the narrative of Venture Smith in that kind of way too. So I hope you like it. I hope you find it interesting, and yeah, I think that will really have an important part of what we're looking at here too. So if you have questions, I'm going to pause the recorder now after this, but just let me know and explore the materials on here. Again, they're all for you, just extras, in addition to kind of what's here this week, not meant to make your life hard, just give you some more background knowledge.